Hey, I am Max, and I am super excited to be here today. When Harry reached out and asked me to speak at All Day Hey, that was one of my favorite emails I've ever gotten. I'm a huge fan of the conference, and the fact that I get to speak at it is absolutely incredible. Unfortunately, this time I could not use that as an opportunity to visit Leeds, but I hope we can make that happen next year. Either way, I'm super excited to be here today and speak about one of life's, I guess, fundamental questions. What do I want to do with my life? When I thought about what I wanted to talk about today, I realized that that's the question I had spent the most time thinking about over the past half a year or so. It all started in 2017. I was a young engineer working at an Australian agency called ThinkMill. And ThinkMill employed me to work full-time on open source, which is freaking cool, right? Who gets to work full-time on open source? It's kind of incredible. And I had this incredible opportunity to work for them, and they built this in-house open source content management system called Keystone. And so I was employed to maintain that content management system and add features to it and fix bugs and help them be successful with it. And while I was doing that, and while I was visiting them in Sydney, I also met Glenn Mattern, who was the original creator of CSS modules. And together we created styled components. While it wasn't directly a ThinkMill project, they were extremely supportive and with me exploring that because it was very relevant to what they were doing. And so I thankfully got to work on it and launch it eventually. And it's by now gotten to be my most popular open source project, which is quite cool. And in fact, it's the HTTP archive recently did a huge analysis of their entire dataset, and they came to the conclusion that style components is used on about 1% of all publicly crawlable websites, which is kinda very cool. The fact that we invented that is really cool, and I'm really proud of that work. But really what that work led to is even cooler, because one day, a couple months after we had announced style components and made it public and people started using it, a guy named Bryn Jackson reached out to me. Now, Bryn at the time was, I think, working at Figma or had just left Figma, and he was rebuilding his personal portfolio website, bryn.io, with style components. And he reached out and told me that he had a bit of an issue with a big flash of unstyled content ever since he started using style components, and whether I had any idea what to do, how to fix it. Now, I had known of Bryn and his best friend Brian Lovin for a long time. Bryn Jackson and Brian Lovin are two very well-known designers in the industry because they created the Design Details podcast together, which is one of the most popular podcasts on design on the internet. And so I've been following both of them for a while because I'm a huge fan of good design, and I like, even though I'm not very good at design, I like staying in touch with that community and that industry. And so I've been following them for a while. And when he reached out, I was overjoyed, honestly, because he's somewhat of a hero of mine, and he and Brian are both heroes of mine. And so when he reached out and said, "Hey, I have this issue, can you help me fix it?" Of course I said yes, and I helped him resolve his issue and fix that flash of unstyled content by implementing server-side rendering properly with styled components. And he was super grateful and said, "Hey, building this portfolio was kind of a great intro to styled components. I'm super stoked to use it for Spectrum." And I said, "Oh, that's awesome. What's Spectrum?" And so Bryn and Brian had been building this community around their podcast for a while. They turned Design Details into this podcast network called Spec FM, where they hosted more than just Design Details, but a whole set of, I think, 8 or 9 podcasts. And to connect all the listeners together, they created a Slack workspace and invited everybody there to chat with each other about the contents of the podcast, but really about anything at all, right? It was basically 8,000 or 9,000 developers and designers and other tech people in one Slack, just having a chat, having a goof, just talking about anything they care about. And that worked really well until Slack came to them and said, "Hey, what you're doing is really cool and we like it, but please either pay us for this workspace or go somewhere else. Now, Slack charged at the time, I think, $5 per active user, and they had about 8,000 active users. So they were looking at paying $45,000 every single month for their free community, which they obviously couldn't afford, right? Who can afford to pay that amount of money for a free community? That makes no sense. And so they looked around at different options, but none of them really appealed to them because they realized what they wanted to build was, what they wanted to use was something that was public and crawlable, because there were a ton of interesting conversations happening in that Slack, in that community, that really didn't need to be locked to this one Slack. They didn't need to be private and behind authentication, right? Like anybody should be able to read those. And they looked around at whether there was anything that solved that use case, but nothing really that did or even does today. And so they started building Spectrum. And I said, that is super cool. That is amazing. I mean, I'd been building communities for my open source projects like React Boilerplate and Style Components, but I'd always put them on GitHub, which was one big chat room, right? Literally one big chat room for all of the tens of thousands of people that use Style Components and React Boilerplate, which obviously doesn't work, right? If you only have a single chat room, that can never scale to that size of conversation. Never mind being publicly indexed, right? GitHub was also behind auth, and I was like, this is amazing. I want to help you as much as I can. And so they pinged me over the month with, or over a week or something with some more questions about Style Components and how to do certain things, how to do media queries, how to do other stuff. And I answered all of their questions, and we eventually had a call where I helped them a little bit. And then Bryn sent me this very life-changing message, even though I didn't know it at the time. He said, we seem to work well together. Brian just mentioned you want to work on Spectrum with us. Any idea how you'd like to be compensated so we can talk to John, who at the time was their other technical person? Profit share or something? And through that resulted a bunch of conversations about where they wanted Spectrum to go, what they wanted to do with it, what I wanted to do with my life. And eventually they offered me to come on board as a co-founder of a new company that was going to build Spectrum, amongst other things initially, but eventually we decided to focus on Spectrum. And I didn't know what to say because I was living the dream, right? I had a job. I was employed to work on open source. That's not something many people get to do. I'm eternally grateful to ThinkMill, and particularly Jed Watson, the founder of ThinkMill, for making that happen for me. And I didn't want to leave that behind, right? It felt kind of odd because I'd sort of achieved the dream. Everybody wants to work on open source, and I get to work on open source, right? Like, why would I leave? That makes no sense. But I also realized that this kind of was probably an opportunity of a lifetime, right? Bryn and Brian are two of the very best designers on the planet. They worked at Buffer, Facebook, and Figma, and they had a wealth of experience that I could learn from. And I realized that even if the company thing didn't go anywhere, just working with them for a couple of months, I would learn so much about design and about how to build a company that I could then use in the future, right? And also they were just awesome people. Like, they're just two great, really nice folks that I love to talk to and hang out with. And so I said yes. I said I'm going to join Spectrum. I told Jed Watson that I unfortunately wasn't going to work for him anymore, which made me really sad, but also I was very excited about this upcoming opportunity. And so we started hacking on Spectrum and we started building this thing together. And a couple of months later, I even flew out to San Francisco and actually met these two in person for the first time, which is kind of crazy, right? Nowadays, that's maybe a little bit more normal, but we're talking 2017. I'd never met those two. I'd never met Bryn and Brian in person before I decided to co-found a company with them, which kind of interesting, right? But I flew out and they're as nice in person, or even nicer in person than they are online, and we had a great time. And basically, life was great, right? We were in San Francisco hacking away from Bryn's apartment. We'd set up sort of temporary workstations there, and we were just hacking away on Spectrum, building a product, designing things, engineering things. And after a couple months of working on Spectrum, we realized that it was going to take a while longer than we thought it would, because it's quite a complex product to build. We wanted it to be a public, real-time community platform, which is the combination of public, real-time, and community means that there's a very high bar for quality. And so we realized we needed more time than we had money for. And we went to investors and we raised a pre-seed round. And we raised a little bit of money from friends of Bryn and Brian. And life was even better, right? Now we're even getting paid for working on Spectrum, which is amazing, right? And we were just building our product. Now, a short side note on taking money from investors, right? As soon as you take money from investors, you are a startup. And a startup, the fundamental reason a startup exists is because of growth. If a startup doesn't grow, then it dies, right? By taking money from investors, you put yourself onto a trajectory. And if you don't manage to go down that sort of exponential growth trajectory, you're not going to get follow-up investment, and you're essentially just going to die, and your product is going to crash into the ground, and you're going to be very sad. That's not something that many people realize, right? If I were to build a business today that makes $10 million a month, or a year even, right? $10 million a year, that's a lot of money, right? That's holy shit, that would be amazing, right? But if you take money from investors, that's kind of like not good enough, right? If you just hit a ceiling at $10 million, you have basically failed at building a startup, because the only thing that matters is that you become the next Dropbox or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and you get to that $1 billion valuation and you IPO. And that's the only thing that matters. And so the only thing that matters for startups is growth. And we knew that going in, right? And we were sort of excited about the prospect of trying to grow a new social network, which is something that not many people had attempted for a while, because it is really difficult. Now, we thankfully had kind of an advantage, right? We had the existing community of SpecFM. And so one of the first things we did once we had a prototype was we transitioned the SpecFM community from Slack to Spectrum. Now, the screenshot I show you here is what Spectrum looks like today, because we don't have a screenshot, unfortunately, of what Spectrum looked like back then. It was very different, but the thread is still the original one, where we invited everybody on board. And people came in droves. Thousands of people from that community checked out Spectrum and started talking and chatting with each other, right? And that was amazing. We had our first growth to basically thousands of users without really having to do any work at all, which was awesome, right? That was a great starting point. Unfortunately, at the same time, we also very quickly realized that Firebase, the technology we're using to store our data, does not scale. And it became really slow, and permissions were really hard to handle. And it became really difficult to use Spectrum already, even though it was just 1,000 people, which is way less than the amount of people we wanted to use Spectrum. So we were kind of in a mess, right? And I don't want to sort of diss Firebase at all. Firebase is a great technology, and it helped us get something out there really quickly. But for that specific use case of a public real-time community platform, it just didn't work very well. And so we looked around at different options, but very quickly decided that we were going to need to build a custom backend based on Node.js, because we were all JavaScript developers. And we did that. Over the next couple of months, we worked on that Node.js backend. And in October of 2017, or almost November, I think, we launched Spectrum publicly. And it went pretty well. Our growth started to pick up just organically, right? We started getting traffic just because all of the content that was on there was public and search index. And so people were finding Spectrum through Google. They were sharing the conversations publicly. They were sharing them with friends. And so Spectrum started having this really nice growth, and we were sort of growing 10% week over week, which is the benchmark you're supposed to do as a startup. And life was great, right? Everybody was happy. We were growing. We got a ton of feedback from our users. And so we were implementing new features, fixing bugs, doing all the things you're supposed to do. And then our servers started crashing. And our servers started crashing with out-of-memory errors, which turned out to be a memory leak. And in fact, this memory leak that we had didn't just crash our servers once, it crashed it every single day, at least once. Which, of course, if you're building a real-time public community platform, which I've now said 1,000,000 times, that's really bad news, because users expect you to be there. And you can't just be down, you can't just be unreliable or lose messages. Imagine if somebody writes a message or writes a post, they try to post it, the server's down, and their message is gone. That was what the experience of using Spectrum at that stage was like. It was terrible, right? And we were dismayed. And in fact, not only were we dismayed, but our users were also very unhappy with us. And our growth slowed down. In fact, we were almost shrinking, which is the absolute worst thing that can happen to you as a startup. Because like I said, a startup is growth. And if you don't have growth, then you're basically dead. So we were kind of in a mess. Now, I have to take full responsibility for this. I had never built a production backend before, never mind for a real-time public thing, right? I had no idea what I was doing. I was more or less a front-end developer with a little bit of Node.js experience from Keystone, but not a lot. And I really had no idea what I was doing with databases, what I was doing with scaling, what I was doing with caching. I had no idea what the hell I was doing. And so I dug deep into our database drivers, our Redis setup, our caching setup. I tried to figure out how can I fix this memory leak. I tried adjusting the pool options for our database driver because we were getting database errors, and so we thought it might be related to that. We tried limiting the amount of DB connections our servers could have. We reached out to friends and advisors that we had, like Guillermo Rauk, and asked them, hey, have you seen this before? How do we solve this? How do we fix this? What do we do, right? And we implemented their suggestions, and nothing worked. We kept crashing every single day, all the way through December of 2017, all the way through Christmas and early January. That was one of the most stressful Christmases I've ever had, honestly, because I was every single day, my brain was just like thinking, why do we have a memory leak? Where could this problem be? Like, how can I fix this? Because I was the most technical person, right? The other two, while Bryn and Brian can code, they really were designers, and I was sort of the engineer on the team, and it was my responsibility, right? I should have been the one to fix this and to even never let it happen in the first place, but at least fix it once it happens. And I racked my brain and I read through all of our code 50 times, but I just could not find the problem. And so eventually we decided in January, okay, we've now spent 2 months crashing every single day. We have to implement just superficial fixes, right? So we implemented too busy handling so that our servers would respond with too busy when they were down at least. And then our host would sort of cycle around the different server instances that we had based on which one was healthy and which one wasn't, which was a nice superficial patch, right? We added retries to our client-side data fetches so that our clients would retry when network requests failed. We added a UI to the app itself that showed users when they weren't connected and disallowed them from sending messages so they wouldn't lose any content, which were all super incredibly important, but also all completely superficial patches that didn't fix the underlying issues. And so we're now talking 2 to 3 months of daily server crashes and a terrible experience for our users. And suddenly I have an idea. I kept thinking about this problem and I realized the way we were handling all of our real time was that we were creating one change feed per database table. Now, change feeds are a RethinkDB feature that lets you listen to changes on any database query, basically. And so we had sort of like 3 big change feeds, one for every thread that changed, one for every message that changed, and one for every community that changed. And we basically pipe all of the data through those 3 change feeds, and then on the server side, filter them out based on who was listening to the real-time events. And I realized that actually, through talking to RethinkDB core developers, RethinkDB was meant to have more ephemeral change feeds, right? We basically had 3 very long-lived change feeds that lived for the basically life cycle of a server. But instead, RethinkDB recommended to have more ephemeral change feeds that were specific to users, right? So we would create a change feed for every user that connected to our server, and then that change feed would already be filtered by what the user cared about. So we would listen to changes on, I don't know, the threads table, to new threads or new messages in the threads that the user was looking at. And so while we had a lot more change feeds, we also connected and disconnected relatively more frequently. Rather than having one very long-lived change feed, we had thousands of very short-lived ones, which was supposed to fix our problems. And I submitted that PR and I implemented it that way, and our memory leaks went away. We had fixed the issue, except we were now hitting database connection errors. And not only did we hit database connection errors, but we went from daily server memory leak crashes to hourly database crashes. So we weren't crashing once a day anymore, we were crashing once an hour or more. Oh my God, I made it even worse. That made me very sad. And I realized I had no idea how to fix this problem and no one else could help me, and I just had to figure it out. And then one random day, I remember standing in the shower, and I wasn't even thinking about this. I was just standing in the shower, washing my hair, minding my own business, when suddenly another idea popped into my head. And not only an idea, but I actually realized what the problem was that we were hitting with memory leaks. Because we'd essentially had this period of memory leaks in our server that I tried to fix by changing the change feed setup. but I hadn't really fixed the memory leaks. I'd only made the crashes more frequent so that our servers could never have the time to run out of memory, right? If the servers run out of memory once a day, but you're crashing every hour, of course, the server never has time to run out of memory. So you're not getting the memory leaks anymore, but you still have the memory leak in your code. It just doesn't happen anymore because the server crashes too quickly. And as I was brewing on this whole problem, I realized there's a function in this util that we use to convert the callback-based database listeners to an async iterator, because what we're using for real-time was GraphQL subscriptions, and that expects an async iterator. And I'd never worked with async iterators before, so I basically just copy and pasted a bunch of code from Stack Overflow that turns a callback-based listener into an async iterator. And I'd looked at that piece of code, I'd read through it like 50 times because it seemed like such an obvious source of the problem, but I could never figure out what that actually does and whether it was actually the problem. And then while I was standing in the shower, not even thinking about this, it hit me. There's a function in that asyncify util that I'd copy and pasted that is called empty queue. But that function is only called when the async iterator either crashes or errors or finishes. But of course, our async iterators didn't really do that. And what I realized was if there's an empty queue function, then that means there must be a queue that things are getting written to, right? And what actually happened was that this util did buffering. So whenever a new message came in from the database, it would sort of buffer all of the stuff that came in from the database. Even as users were coming and going to the server, it just kept buffering all the stuff that changed in our database basically forever, which obviously caused our server to run out of memory because that's a lot of data. Particularly as we kept growing and got more users, that just became more and more data. And I stood in the shower and I had this revelation, and I just immediately sat down and coded out the solution, merged it, and that actually finally fixed our scaling problems. Literally, that one fix, it was a tiny fix, less than 100 lines of code, but that fixed our problems and we were finally back to normal. Spectrum was stable, the database was all right, no more connection errors, no more memory leaks, everything was perfect. And with that, our growth resumed. And we started going back to the up and to the right, exactly as a startup is meant to do. And life was great. And in fact, based on that, Zeit, now called Vercel, decided to move their entire community, including the Next.js community, to Spectrum. And we just kept growing. We just kept growing up and to the right. And life was great. Everything was going exactly as it is supposed to do, right? We were growing as startups are supposed to do. People were happy with our app, even though we still had a lot of work to do. It worked, and it did what it was supposed to do. And everything was great, except we were running out of money. Because we never built any business thing into Spectrum, right? And we were kind of running out of money. Our investor money wasn't going to last for much longer. And the problem was that no investor wanted to give us more money. And the reason is that usually when you build a social network or any kind of user-generated content site, think Quora, Facebook, Google, Twitter, right? All of these sites that have user-generated content, all of them monetize by having ads and selling the user's data. And we just did not want to do that, right? We did not want to sell our users' data. We were just ethically opposed to that. We did not want to build a business based on selling our users' data. And so we just didn't know how to make money. We figured we'll figure it out eventually, but now was the time to figure it out. And so we butted our heads together and we launched a product called Spectrum Concierge, where we would essentially community manage a company's community for them. And, well, nobody cared. Literally not a single person bought that thing. So we were kind of in a mess. We literally had no other ideas of what we wanted to do, except for doing ads, which again, we really did not want to do for ethical reasons. And Bryn randomly reached out to a friend at GitHub and said, hey, we have this problem, blah, 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 blah. Wouldn't GitHub maybe be interested in acquiring Spectrum? And GitHub said, maybe. It's actually not too bad of an idea, because at the time, Spectrum was really mainly used by open source communities. Lots of open source projects hosted their communities on Spectrum, like Style Components, React Boilerplate, Next.js, and they'd all seen some sort of success with it. And so GitHub was like, yeah, maybe actually not a bad idea, right? Like, what if we could actually integrate this into GitHub? And then came the due diligence. Now, for people that have never been through an acquisition before, like I had never been through an acquisition or even close to an acquisition before. I had no idea what that meant. But essentially, it means hundreds of questions. And the thing is, they send you these questions that are extremely detailed, right? They go into every single detail, from what are the people that are working this, what are their histories, what have they done before, what have they done at Spectrum, to your technical stack, like which technologies are used, why did you use Node.js for the backend, why did you use RethinkDB, which problems have you had, how much code is there, blah, 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 all of these questions. And the thing is, from the other side, you have no idea which of these questions could be a deal breaker. And I was extremely worried that something that I'd done, like a technical decision or a code decision or something we'd built, would be a deal breaker for GitHub, because we did not know what was a deal breaker, right? Maybe they said, oh, you're hosted on site. Well, then that's a deal breaker and we can't buy, right? Or maybe they would have said, hey, you're using Node.js? Yeah, we're not interested, right? And I just had no idea. And that meant I had sleepless nights for months. Now, I tend to be a very good sleeper, thankfully, which I'm very grateful for. But in those months, I really did not sleep very well, because I was just constantly worried that I would be the one that answered that one question that GitHub really cared about wrong. And so the whole deal would fall through. But as many of you probably know, ultimately, the deal did go through and GitHub did acquire Spectrum. And life was good again, right? We had founded the startup. We'd had a great time for 1.5 years. And then while we didn't really succeed in building a business out of it, we built something people liked, right? And ultimately even got acquired by GitHub, which is just fantastic, right? And if I were to summarize all of this sort of founding a startup thing in one graph, it would be this, right? Over the 1.5 years that we built Spectrum, this was sort of my emotional state, with the big red part being when we had all the memory leaks, and at the end, the sort of dip was when we went through the due diligence. So there was a lot of up and down, but even still, it was a great experience, right? And overall, I would probably give those 1.5 years an 11 out of 10, right? It was a great experience. When I think about in that moment where I decided to found Spectrum with Bryn and Brian, would I make that same decision again, knowing what I know now? And the answer is 100 times yes, 1,000,000 times yes. I would make that choice every single time, because it was 100% worth it. And then we joined GitHub and we started working at GitHub on various projects, and it was fine, right? I was at GitHub also a year or a year and a half. And if I were to summarize it in one graph, it would be this, but it's like, you can see it's sort of, it was fine, right? Like there wasn't as much up and down. It was just sort of like fine the whole time, right? Like there was nothing bad, but there was also nothing very exciting, right? It was sort of like flat the whole time. And I just kept doing my job, and I loved my team. I worked with really great people at GitHub. Basically everybody I worked with at GitHub was great. And so I had a good time, and it was fine. And overall, I would probably give that time a 5 out of 10. Now, going from an 11 out of 10 to 5 out of 10, of course, is kind of meh, you know? Like, it was fine. It was a job. It just wasn't right for me. That's not a knock on GitHub or on what we worked on or on my team at all. It's just, for me personally, I just wasn't as happy as I could be. I just didn't feel as good as I could, as I know I could. And so I looked around and I realized Gatsby was hiring for a really exciting position, and I applied and they hired me. And so I joined Gatsby. Now, Gatsby is a startup, but they already have 60 people, or had 60 people when I joined. And so it was sort of like a bigger startup, which was nice because I wanted to see what that's like. And life was exciting again, right? I joined a new company, I joined a new team. The people at Gatsby were great. The team I was on was great. I worked on really cool stuff. And after a year, I looked back and I realized that still it was great, but also it was kind of fine again. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't as exciting as building Spectrum. It was maybe a little bit more exciting than GitHub, but also it was still sort of like a 6 out of 10 on the overall scale. Now, again, not a knock on Gatsby at all, not a knock on my teammates at all. I had a great time working at Gatsby. Just for me personally, it didn't really fulfill me as much as I hoped it would. And so I was sort of again in the state of, well, what do I do? How do I get back to that 11 out of 10, right? Like, what do I really want in life, and how the hell do I figure that out? And so I went to my coach and I discussed with him for a while, and he basically posed the question of, what do you actually value? Figure out what do you actually value? What made you so happy about building Spectrum, or what made you less happy about working at GitHub and Gatsby? And that was one of the hardest things I've ever done, because it required being extremely honest with myself. Now, I'm going to share the list of things that I value and that I don't value. I didn't expect to share this publicly ever, but I realized if I don't show you the list, most of what I say is not going to make any sense, so I kind of have to share it. Take that list with a grain of salt. It's very rough, right? It was just me writing for myself, trying to figure out what do I value, but also what do I really not value? What do I not care about? What do I want, right? Which required being really honest with myself. And here's where I arrived. The list is what I value is connection, responsibility, agency, variety, openness, and prestige. And also what I don't value is money and impact. And a couple of those pieces were really hard for me to admit. The fact that I don't care about impact is kind of like maybe a little bit even of a red flag for potential employers. Because when you work, for example, at GitHub and at Gatsby, the promotion process is based entirely on impact. What impact have you had in the last year? And you're supposed to aim for the maximum amount of impact, right? Reach the maximum amount of people, change the trajectory, the maximum amount of possible, and you get rewarded for that. But personally, I don't care. I worked at GitHub on stuff that impacts millions of developers, right? And at Spectrum, I would have been happy. I would have been just as happy had we built something that only the 5,000 people in the SpecFM community used. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't care about the scale of that impact. I just cared about making some people's lives better. That was what I ultimately cared about, but I didn't care about having a large impact. The same thing goes for money. Personally, I live in Austria, right? I don't need a ton of money, and I don't even know what to spend it on, right? I don't really have a need for a ton of money that a well-paying job would give me, right? And on the other side, the other thing that was really hard for me to admit was that I really care about prestige. I care about people thinking well of me. I care about connection to people, and I care about that those people like me, that people like me, and that's a hard thing to admit because it's sort of superficial, but it is just the truth, right? If I look at my life, there's a reason I have way too many followers on Twitter and I spend way too much time on there, right? It's because I care about that prestige, and that was really hard for me to admit. But once I admitted it, I realized, this is actually really helpful, because now that I know what I care about and also what I really don't care about, I can sort of compare my options, right? Which at the time were keep doing my job or maybe find a new job, or maybe go do my own thing again, which was very scary, honestly. And so I looked at the list and I said, okay, if I stay at my job or I get a new job, whatever, how does that cover sort of the things that I care about, right? And it definitely covers connection, it definitely covers prestige, and it definitely covers money and impact. But it sort of covers less responsibility, agency, variety, and openness, because when you are at a company and you have a job, you just have to do your job, right? Like, you're an engineer, you're engineering. You can't just decide that the most important thing the company needs right now is marketing and go do marketing, because you're going to step on the marketing team's toes, right? And also, even if you're high up, really, you're not going to have a lot of responsibility at a big company. If there's 6,000 people in a company, the amount of responsibility you're going to have is relatively limited, and never mind agency or openness. Now compare that to founding another startup, right? That basically covers everything that I really value. I have all the agency, variety, openness, and responsibility that I could ever hope for. Now, in terms of money or impact, the story is a bit different, because when you found a startup, right, only about 1% of startups is successful. And so whether or not you're going to make money and whether or not you're going to have impact is highly unlikely, honestly. It's much more safe and stable to go for a job if that's what you value. Because if you go work at GitHub or something, you're A, going to make a lot of money, and B, you're also going to have a lot of impact, right? There's no way you're not going to have either of those. But since I didn't really care about them that much, I was like, that's a trade-off I'm willing to take, right? If I found a startup and it doesn't go anywhere and I don't have any impact and I don't make any money, whatever, right? As long as I make enough to live and I make at least one person's life better, I don't care. That's not what I'm optimizing for. What I'm optimizing for is all of these other things that a startup definitely has. And so at that point, I just still wasn't sure though. So I kept talking with my friends, right? And some of them reminded me that I am in the 0.1% of people on the planet that are both privileged enough and have the ability to actually try building a $1 billion company, right? There's whatever 9 billion people on the planet. Maybe there's 10 million people on the planet that have the privilege and the ability to try to build a $1 billion company, and I am in that 0.1%, right? I have, whether I'm going to be successful or not, I have no idea, but I am in the 0.1% that can even try. And so why wouldn't I? You know what I mean? If it's the thing I enjoy, if it makes me happy, why wouldn't I do that, right? And then I kept reflecting, what does it mean to fail, right? What even is failure, right? And to me, honestly, failure would be if I spent my life doing something that I don't enjoy. Because ultimately, I spend way too much time at work, right? 40 hours a week at least, I'm thinking about work. So probably a third to a half of my awake time is spent on this one thing. And if I'm not enjoying that time, why am I doing it, right? And if you think about how startups fail, right? Like we've failed at Spectrum, right? Like we didn't build a business. We couldn't raise any money anymore from investors. We had to get acquired, and we couldn't sort of fulfill the dream of what we were trying to build. But honestly, did we really fail? I had a great time building Spectrum. I made a bunch of friends. I made a bunch of new experiences. I had a really exciting 1.5 years that I always fondly remember. Does that sound like failure? To me, it doesn't. And that's when I realized I cannot fail, right? I literally cannot fail if I found a startup. Even if I do that and I build something for a year and it doesn't go anywhere and I have to shut it down and it just didn't go anywhere, right? Nobody ever cared. Well, then I probably still had a great time, right? I'm probably still happier than if I'm spending 40 hours a week doing something that I don't enjoy. And in fact, I'm actually very certain that that's the case. I would enjoy my time more and I would be more happy. And ultimately, I only have this one life, right? I mean, YOLO is sort of like a stupid thing that teenagers say, but really, you do only live once, right? And I only have this one life. And why would I spend my time doing something that I don't enjoy? That makes no sense to me. That's failure. Trying something and it not succeeding, that's not failure. That's fun. That's exciting. That's what I want to do with my life. And so I decided I'm going to found another startup. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody should found a startup, right? That was very much based on what I personally value and based on my own personal experience, my own personal privilege, my own personal ability, where I'm at in my life. That is the right choice for me. That doesn't mean it's the right choice for you, but what I'm trying to say here is think critically about what you actually value, because you only have this one life and you better spend it doing something that you really enjoy. Now, the obvious next question then is, what the hell do I found and with whom, right? And I kept thinking about this topic and I kind of wrote a list of problems to see what resonated, but really, I didn't really find anything I was particularly excited about, right? I sort of was at my job and it was kind of fine, right? But like, I knew I wanted to found something new, but I didn't know what. I didn't have an idea. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know with whom I was going to do something. Everybody that I liked was kind of busy or doing their own thing, or I don't know. I just didn't find anything that resonated. But remember when I said I talked with my friends about my future? Now, just before I keep going, one quick disclaimer. Everything I say now is confidential. Now, of course, this is a public conference talk that you all are watching. And so saying it's confidential is kind of stupid because obviously it's not confidential anymore if I talk about it and share it publicly. What I mean by this is I haven't talked about this publicly. I haven't told anyone except you. You're literally the first people to hear this. And so we're not quite ready. I'm not quite ready to tell everybody, right? But I did want to sort of I didn't want to end the talk without saying what I arrived at, right? That would be extremely unsatisfying. So I do want to talk about it. Just if you could, please don't share it too widely yet. What I'm working on is going to be public in a couple of weeks at the latest. And at that point, I would be more than excited for all of you to talk about it publicly and share it widely. But for now, if you could, please just keep it confidential. I know it's kind of stupid, but please just don't tweet about it. And you know what I mean. Anyways, with that out of the way, so what happened was I was talking to a friend of mine called Andreas Klinger, who was this ex-CTO of Product Hunt. And he had another friend in Berlin called Tim. And Tim had been working on a side project called GraphCDN. which was a GraphQL CDN. And so Andreas introduced us both, and he was like, hey, Tim has been building this thing called Graph CDN, but doesn't quite know where to take it. And Max, you're looking for something new to do. Maybe this is an opportunity for you two to work together. And I was like, well, this is awesome, because when we were building Spectrum, remember how I said we had all of these scaling problems? Well, we actually tried to find a solution for that by simply caching our GraphQL API. We were using GraphQL, and we just wanted to put something in front of our GraphQL API to cache it, and it would have probably allowed us to scale a lot further than we were able to do, and it would have alleviated a lot of the scaling problems that we ended up running into. But that just didn't exist. And I totally forgotten about that problem and that thought that I had, I don't know, 2 years ago, until Andreas basically said, hey, Tim built a prototype of this. And so what he had built is Graph CDN, a CDN for a GraphQL API. And I looked at it and I was like, damn, this is really cool. This is exactly what I'd envisioned back then, but I didn't have the skills to build it. And Tim had just built it as a side project next to his job at Prisma. And so I was like, Tim, we got to hop on a call. We did calls for like 2 weeks straight, basically figured out where our heads at. Do we want to work together? Like, what are we like? I flew to Berlin for a week to meet him and hang out with him. I stayed in his apartment on his couch, and basically we just spent the entire week chatting with each other and talking with each other and trying to figure out who are we, right? Like, and where do we want to go? What are our goals? What are our values? Are we aligned? And after that week, we decided we're going to co-found Graph CDN together. And that's what I've been doing for the past months. And now, just to sort of really tie the knot here and tie the loop and not leave you all empty-handed, here's a very quick demo of Graph CDN, where you can see a GraphQL API where we query some data. Now, the server takes about 900 milliseconds to return that, and we pipe it through Graph CDN, which actually caches it. And we set the max age to 300 seconds. And then the next time you request the same thing, it's cached. And suddenly it doesn't even hit the GraphQL server anymore, right? And even if 500 users request the same data, it's always cached. And it takes about 30 milliseconds to return, and that's it. And now here comes the really cool part though. When you now send a GraphQL mutation to change that data, in this case, edit the project with a new name, normally the old data would still be returned for 300 milliseconds until the max age expires. But with Graph CDN, because we're aware of GraphQL and we know that those mutations have run and have changed the data, we actually invalidate that data globally, and you get the fresh data fully automatically. And once that data has been requested once, the fresh data is cached again and cached globally. And that actually enables people to cache a lot more data than they normally could with a normal GraphQL API. So that's what I've been working on with Tim for the past months. This part works, and we're very excited about where we want to go. Again, please keep this quiet for now. If you do have a GraphQL API, please come talk to me. Just ping me on Twitter, ping me via email, because we would love to have you on board as one of our first customers. But for now, that's sort of where we're at, and that's what I want to show today. To sort of tie the knot on everything and answer the question that I posed in the title of this talk, how I decided what to do with my life is, one, I got outside perspectives from people that know me well. I talked to friends. I asked them, what do you think I should do? What is your view of me? I went to my coach and asked him, how do I figure this out? Which led to having a really honest conversation with myself about what I really value personally in life. What do I really want to spend my time doing? And I also realized that what I do doesn't really have to be for everyone, right? It just has to be right for me. That's all that ultimately matters. I want to spend my time doing something that I enjoy. And maybe this talk, I sounded a little bit like I sort of glorified startups and that everybody should found startups, but that's not actually the point of this. The point of this is founding startups is right for me. And I figured that out by having a really honest conversation with myself about what I really value. Go out there and have that really honest conversation with yourself. What do you actually value? What do you actually deeply care about, and what are you completely irrelevant about? And once you know that, it's going to become much easier to make a decision. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I look forward to chatting about this and hearing all of your questions.